This is your reality check.
Hi everyone, and welcome to The Reality Check, the Canadian show that explores a wide range of controversies and curiosities using science and critical thinking. I'm your host, Darren McKee, and with me, as usual, is Adam Gardner.
Hey, what's up, Cuboids?
We have a great show for you today. I'm going to talk to you about whether the 401 is the busiest highway in the world.
Oh, I've heard that.
But first, we get a book roundup from Adam. Family Unfriendly and 1 Billion Americans. What's going on with these books, Adam?
Great question, Darren. I recently read these two books, which both touched on tangentially related issues. This is more or less a coincidence, though the similar factor is that I chose to read these books, so there's probably some bias here, and we can find reasons for that. Maybe that was something that was just on my mind.
Are you saying you are the common variable for all books you read?
I am absolutely the common variable. Oh my god, I happened to read another book that had robots in it. What a coincidence! So both of these were on the topic of human fertility. I thought this would be a nice opportunity to discuss that issue. This won't just be a book review, but just a discussion of the topics presented in these. The first is Family Unfriendly, How Our Culture Made Raising Kids Much Harder Than It Needs to Be by Timothy Carney. And the second was 1 Billion Americans, The Case for Thinking Bigger by Matthew Yglesias. So they aren't really the same topic, strictly speaking, but one talks about why we aren't having kids and what to do about it, and the other tries to argue why we should be having a lot more people in the US in this particular case. So I find they complement each other somewhat. First, let's look at Family Unfriendly. Sort of hook to sell the book here is that our current culture is hostile to raising kids, that we've made it a more stressful and unpleasant thing than it needs to be. There's more to it than that, but I think that's the sort of novel thing that this book is doing that other books haven't, so that was kind of the selling point. Along the way, it looks at the fertility crisis, that Americans and those in many other countries aren't having enough kids, that the fertility rate is basically below replacement value, which isn't really sustainable. The author, Tim Carney, is a Christian and the father of 6 children. This is reflected in the work. He approaches the idea of having children as being inherently good. This is a view that not everyone shares, but I happen to share. He supports the argument, but ultimately that's sort of a question of your own personal values. We can use evidence to support those ideas, or we can use evidence to support or discount the arguments one might use for why they think that they have a particular view on this. Ultimately, though, the low fertility rate seems to be something counter to what people want. It's consistently shown that the number of children people want is higher than the number of children that they actually have. So we can say it would be good if people had more children in that sense.
That's interesting.
So by arguing that having children is inherently good, he's trying to counter some of the arguments against it and some of the culture which he sees as making parenthood seem unappealing. So one issue is something he calls the travel team trap. When I was a kid, I was in some sports. I never went far in them because I wasn't good at them. But I did some soccer, some t-ball, a short stint doing a judo class. I had friends who were in sports. Again, it didn't consume their lives. They didn't take it all that seriously. They weren't trying to go pro. These days, really for fun, recreational sports for kids is something that drops off after a fairly young age compared to when I was young. Sports get very competitive with packed schedules, tournaments, tons of traveling. For example, anecdotal example, my kids are 6 and 7. They are in a competitive ski team. They have 5.5 hours of class every Saturday and Sunday throughout the winter, as well as all days during the winter break that aren't stat holidays.
Wow.
To further complicate my life, the ski hill is 2.5 hours drive from my house.
Oh.
So they also travel to other ski hills to participate in competitions. I went to one on Saturday. It was a great time. So I certainly sympathize with this complaint and think that is potentially a problem for a lot of parents. That said, is this the reason for which people aren't having kids?
Yep. Oh, sorry.
Well, that's kind of the beauty of this book. It isn't looking for one single cause of the low fertility rate. It argues, I believe accurately, that the problem has many causes and that those illustrated in the book are likely some of them. So even if he gets a couple of these things wrong, I think he is right, broadly speaking, about a lot of what he's saying.
Well, we don't want the single cause fallacy anyway, so yes.
And people are always looking for the reason for the low fertility rate. Like, of course, there's not a reason. So the travel team trap is kind of terrible, but do parents without kids realize this? Does the stressed and sad demeanor of parents of serious athletes who have a very small chance of going pro get seen by childless people and discourage them from having children themselves? I don't know if that's a big deal, but I do agree that the culture is bad. I just don't know if that's really a reason for which people aren't having kids.
I think you're right, even though I was being silly before, but
Sure.
It could be a reason people who have kids don't have more kids.
Oh, yes, maybe. Oh, yeah. Like if you've got 2 kids in sports, you can't possibly fathom having a 3rd kid.
That's
like,
how
we will never be able to keep up with the schedule, right?
Yeah.
Another factor is car seats. A friend of mine once said that he thought car seat laws were a form of birth control. I thought this was funny, but then I realized this myself when my daughter was on the way to make my family at the time grow from 2 to 3 children. Baby seats take a lot of room. You can't put them in the front seat. Older kids need car seats and booster seats, which also takes up a lot of room. Basically, you cannot fit more than 2 car seats in a normal car. You certainly can't fit 2 car seats and a baby car seat in a normal car. You certainly can't fit more than 2 car seats and like a driver and a passenger, like basically 2 parents in a normal car. So at the time we had a Subaru Forester, a decent sized SUV. It would not fit a family of 5 with 3 children. It just wasn't happening. The options were a very large SUV, basically one with a 3rd row, or a minivan. I got a minivan. I didn't care. I know that's a thing people like don't want to do and they think they're giving up on life or whatever. It was fine. It was all right.
You managed. Life moved on.
Yeah. So this is a reason why people get minivans, and it's also a reason why people have 2 kids. I've come from a family of 4 kids. We had a station wagon. On Sundays, we'd pick up my grandma. The 4 kids would all go in the back seat, 2 strapped in the middle. Maybe it wasn't totally legal. It was fine.
The good old days.
Good old days. The good old days where things weren't safe. Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't have car seats. I'm not saying we shouldn't have safety. If a society wants people to have children, those seats and those seat laws need to be able to accommodate a more modest car. So you kind of need to evaluate the trade-off. What's the risk to children's life? What's the value I put on family size and population and things like that? Does this really affect people's choice to have a 3rd kid? The author cites a study that proves that. Here's an abstract from the study, Car Seats as Contraception by Jordan Nickerson of the University of Washington and David Solfelman of Boston College. And I quote, "Using census data and state year variation in laws, we estimate that when women have 2 children of ages requiring mandated car seats, they have a lower annual probability of giving birth by 0.73 percentage points. Consistent with the causal channel, this effect is limited to 3rd child births, is concentrated in households with access to a car, and is larger when a male is present, when both front seats are likely to be occupied. We estimate that these laws prevented only 57 car crash fatalities of children nationwide in 2017, the nation being the US in this case. Simultaneously, they led to a permanent reduction of approximately 8,000 births in the same year and 145,000 fewer births since 1980, with 90% of this decline being since 2000. So this alone, of course, does not describe the US's low birth rate, but this is a factor, even if it's a very small one.
That's pretty huge, depending on your beliefs regarding population ethics.
Mm-hmm. More likely, the impact of these laws is just that it makes having a 3rd child that much more expensive for the parents that do have one. Trading in a perfectly good SUV for a van was not a lot of fun. Talking about the birth rate, the book mentions a baby boomlet, a sort of mini baby boom from 2006. This was a time when many celebrities were having babies, such as Brad Pitt, Tom Cruise, and Britney Spears. The culture was all about babies. I hadn't really thought about it at the time. When I was thinking back, I'm like, oh yeah, that was like tons of people having kids at that time. But this didn't last, and it was followed by a baby bust, where richer countries started having less kids, which persists to this day. One factor he suggests is declining religiosity. Again, the author is Christian, and his views of the importance of having children stem from this. It seems pretty well established that religious people have more children. Religious countries have higher fertility rates. More than just the religion itself, he argues that those religious communities have a cultural effect of increasing fertility of non-religious people who live near them, and he backs that up with numbers. An atheist living near religious communities will have more children than one surrounded by less religious people. And he ascribes this to a culture that encourages having children. When your peers and neighbors see large families as being good, it encourages people to have more children. And there's also a simple contagion about having children. This can be observed in groups of friends fairly easily. A person has a baby, a year later, her friends have one on the way too. Nothing gets that biological clock ticking like holding a friend's baby. There are more factors suggested by the book. The iPhone is one. The baby bust started 1 year after the iPhone. But how would smartphones hurt birth rates? Smartphones mean social media in your pocket. While Facebook was a thing in the days of desktop computers, it became more common with these devices. This in itself isn't a single cause, but he suggests a few causes which tie to phones and social media could be related. One is the rise of momfluencers, so mom influencers. Now, this isn't a world I know about because, I'm a father, but I don't follow like mommy blogs and stuff like that. I find them kind of annoying. But there are a lot of people on social media who are just mom influencers. They can cause envy and awe, but sometimes they can also portray a negative view of parenthood, making it seem unappealing. It can make motherhood seem like a ton of thankless work, basically. There's also the kids using the devices themselves. The trope of iPad kids is real. Kids are drawn to phones and tablets, especially when you've got apps like YouTube on them, any sort of short video site. It turns them into zombies. It's not hard to find kids stuck to their phones when you're out in public. And one effect might just be making parenthood seem less enjoyable. A prospective parent who sees this behavior may not see family life being that appealing. If the kid wasn't distracted by a device, they might be interacting joyfully with their parents, setting a positive example of a desirable life, which others would want to emulate by having children. A bit of a stretch maybe, but I think it could be a small factor into this phenomenon. Another is dating apps. Apps have become more common with smartphones. This is how a lot of people date now, and we could do a whole segment just on dating apps. I think they're kind of terrible, not conducive to relationships and families. The author mentions the paradox of choice, where people see endless options and look for perfection, so they're not really settling on a person because they think they can get someone better. Since these apps become more common, people are having less sex and are in less relationships. So he says hookup culture is a lack of a relationship culture. Marriage rates are down, though reductions in religiosity are surely a factor here. So it's hard to decouple all of these things. Married people have more sex, unmarried people have less sex, and therefore unmarried people have less kids. So there's a lot of factors here. It's not just the dating apps here, but you can see that these are all kind of trends that are leading towards lower fertility rates. Some of these ideas may seem controversial. I think he makes some good points, although I'm not a religious person myself. I don't think it's easy to say like, well, maybe you should just go to church and you'll be happy. Like, what if I don't believe in God?
Does he mention education or economic issues?
That's a good question, Darren. Big idea of why people aren't having kids is money. The author argues, and I think fairly well, that this isn't a good reason. Poor people have more kids than rich people. Those kids do fine. My kids are expensive, and I had much more money before I had them. That said, I would have probably been fine if I had them 15 years earlier. I had my first kid at 39, pretty old. My philosophy is that kids cost what you can afford. They don't really need the newest toy or designer clothes or that fancy vacation. They'll enjoy a trip to Disney World, but they will also enjoy a trip to the play area at McDonald's, and Happy Meals are still about $5. But something the author doesn't really touch on is that I think people do avoid having kids because they think they don't have enough money. So I would suggest that simply educating people that waiting until you're wealthy to have kids is not really necessary. I think it's a mistake. It robs you of time in which you're alive with your children. It robs you of the amount of times you will be able to be alive while your grandchildren are alive when you put those kind of choices off to the distant future.
And I'm going to perhaps disagree.
Okay.
I think you don't have to wait till you're wealthy, but if people who are in poverty are having children, that's going to be a huge stressor on their life that otherwise would not be there if not for the expenses of the children, in many cases. So I really think this is a huge variable, especially depending on how old you are.
Yep.
Like, did you experience the 2007, 2008 financial crisis, and in which way, which even just sort of reduces the belief in economic stability and uncertainty. Yep. So I sometimes think of a particular family or a group or someone who's suffering because they have so many expenses.
Yep.
I'm like, oh wait, if they didn't have kids, they actually wouldn't have debt.
Absolutely.
And so these things are trade-offs for
Yep.
sure, right? And it depends on who you are and what trade-off you're willing to make. But the idea that someone should just go forth and it'll work out, I don't quite agree with that. As you said, I think people give kids way too much. Like, kids are generally happy, as you said, and
Yep.
they can make do with a lot less. But when you start to think about the lives they're going to have, upward economic mobility is a thing. It's just not as much as coming from the similar class as your parents.
So let's just say there's different factors and there's trade-offs to waiting till you have more money versus having them earlier. And I think there's a value in waiting. And I think there's also value in having children earlier. And I think people overestimate the economic hardship And it's not to say that that's not a real thing and it's not a real factor. But I think a lot of people are waiting till they're very advanced financially and career-wise before starting to have kids. And they might be fine if they, say, had kids in their mid-20s versus their late 30s. And they might actually have the number of kids that they want.
Yeah, okay. I mean, we might just see this differently, right? Because Adam has kids and I don't. So,
Sure.
So there's a bit of like, the number of kids I want is 0. So
Yeah, so I happen to as a parent, I value like having children, and that's why I had children in the first place.
well, also,
right?
you better now that you have them.
Yes.
Right?
Well, yes.
So there is that.
So there's a I don't know if confirmation bias is the right word, but yeah, like this is the path I went down and this is the path I decided on. So obviously I'm motivated to believe in that.
And to be fair,
thing.
Similarly with me, right? I've
Yep.
gone down this path and there's motivated reasoning involved in justifying my decisions.
Yes.
So thanks for touching on the economic issue I raised. I also mentioned education because as far as I understand, a woman's level of education is the single greatest predictor of how many children she'll have.
Sure.
Does the book talk about that?
I think he does. I didn't really prepare any of that for my segment, but so what would the response to this? Maybe women should be less educated.
Well,
Right?
I mean, I don't want to say certain faith-based traditions have certain beliefs on that. But
that's fair.
Generally speaking, I think there's the larger trends, like the more education a woman has, the more options she has, that she doesn't need a man in the same way for economic security, and she has her own rights and freedoms, which then changes dating, family structure units, which then affects child rearing and childbirth.
Yep.
So I can't remember the correlational coefficients here. And I'm not saying just because the education level woman is the single greatest predictor, it is the majority predictor. It could just mean it's 0.2 or 0.1 and everything else is much smaller. All that to say is it is multi-causal, but the women's education one seems to be a big one. And my current thought is women should be as educated as much as they want and suffer the consequences, so to speak.
Yeah.
If it ends up with being fewer kids, so be it. That's just how it is. That's how it has to be.
Yeah, that's my thought, and I'll get into this later, but like that's my thought on a lot of these issues is like the things that would cause the birth rate to raise fundamentally go against what I believe to be good. Right. So yes, I believe women should be educated if they wish to be. Right. So yeah, if that's a side effect. Sorry. So we can look at potential incentives to increase birth rates. And sadly, it seems that most of these don't work very well. So it's a question of work, and this kind of ties into the idea of education. Women working more means less babies. In a professional environment, children mean a drop in pay. When we look at the gender pay gap, it isn't that big between childless men and childless women, and it grows when women have children. You could shrink that gap by having less children. What do you as a society value? Daycare can help, right? This is generally suggested. He suggests that subsidizing daycare doesn't subsidize having kids, but it subsidizes work. So if we care about women working, you can still subsidize daycare, but it doesn't necessarily address the dropping birth rate. Depends what you value. The things that do work marginally are direct money to parents or tax credits, because this allows women not to work, to stay at home, and to have more children. If that's what you value, that's something that could work a bit. I'm not saying we should want women not to work, but these are the kind of questions you can ask yourself. The author's wife is a stay-at-home mom. She had a good job, but as his children are still young, she's at home with them full-time because they have a bunch of them. And he has a good job that is able to support her and support their large family. This is more common in religious cultures. He suggests that this is an important component of raising the birth rate to create a culture where staying at home and raising children is seen as worthwhile and a valuable life. He even refers to workism as a type of religion. So he says we live in a culture that valorizes work and that this is part of what encourages women to work more. And an effect of that is lower birth rate.
So when the kids are slightly older, he'd be willing to stay home while she works?
I don't know.
I would guess no.
No. Probably not. So what are some reasons for which people decide not to have kids or say that they don't? There are many people who think having children in 2025 is bad. They think that bringing children into this world because of climate change, capitalism, something bad is horrible. That's a subjective view. You can objectively look at the question. If you could live at any time in human history, you'd probably be better off being alive in the 20th or 21st century than any other time in history. Climate guilt and fear is a stated reason people give for not having children. Climate change is a concern. It seems unlikely to cause widespread suffering for the next generation of children. And that's kind of what you're implying by saying you don't want to bring children into the world because of climate change. Modern society is more economically prosperous than it has been pretty much ever. Even if we are experiencing small economic hardships today compared to recent history, overall the trends are improving in almost every metric, if you go on a wider time frame. He also mentions a concept of civilizational sadness. He says millennials and Gen Z liberals don't think America is good. So what can we actually do to encourage babies? I think that a lot of the things that voters would support wouldn't make a huge difference. Direct financial incentives to parents in a way of money or tax breaks seems to be the only thing that is likely to be popular that could make a small difference. I think there are things which a government could do that would work, but that I don't think are consistent with the ideas of fairness and freedom. I don't think they're good ideas at all, and I think they would just be really unpopular with voters. For example, we could raise the gender pay gap. You could have women make 60% of what men make, and that would make men seem more attractive as potential partners and make it less of an impact to have women stay at home. I think this is a bad idea again, but It's something that could work. You could ban social media and dating apps. You could ban birth control, pornography, and video games. We would surely see an increase in teenage pregnancy. You can enforce a state religion and force people to attend church. I don't know if that would really work, but that could. It could.
You could fully ban abortions too.
Yeah, exactly. It's not that nothing would work. It's more that the things that would work just wouldn't be popular because they require a kind of change that is cultural. And this is hard to do top down. You have to encourage people to have a culture which is more pro-baby and discourage gloomy views of the world. The government can't do this and remain viable and popular.
Adam, you are correct. Those are a series of terrible ideas. From my understanding, that is sort of total factor fertility is going down in most countries on Earth.
Yes.
Most countries are below replacement rate, especially in certain Asian countries. South Korea comes to mind. It's quite low.
Oh, yeah.
And as far as I know, South Korea has tried almost everything, sort of within reason, to address this issue, and nothing has worked.
Yep.
And as you said, there's a cultural thing here where people are now seeing as I don't need to have a baby. I can be fine on my own with my partner or a pet. And I have more money and I can have meaning in my life and I just don't need it. So certain incentives of we'll give you a bit more money if you stay home with a child or people just don't want it. Yep. And largely people like women are enjoying their independence and that's fine for them. So I think it's an interesting thing that many countries will quote unquote grapple with because they will perceive having more kids as important, which, a lot of our social security system is based on these sorts of a pyramid scheme like things. And I'm not sure what's going to happen over the next, decades. I mean, AI is an issue separate from that, though. If we just go pretend AI is nothing for a moment.
Let's ignore the looming threat.
Exactly. Well, maybe that'll solve all the fertility problems both ways. But yeah, I think humans are starting to feel a certain way about having a certain number of children, and it's going to be very, very hard to change that.
I totally agree. So that's a lot on the first book. I want to touch briefly on the second, 1 Billion Americans, The Case for Thinking Bigger by Matthew Yglesias. So the question it addresses is why it's good economically to have more people. So this is often said to be a negative side effect of plummeting birth rates. It's bad for the economy. To me, it's kind of hard to conceptualize, why is more people good for the economy? So he breaks it down a bit. Historically, it seems to be true that more people means economic prosperity. Some people argue this isn't necessary. If you dig really deep, some of these people are just kind of being communists. So the argument is the US has the highest GDP in the world. It did as of the writing of the book. It still does now. In 2024, it was $25.43 trillion, with China lagging behind with $14.72 trillion. Great. Go USA. But China is catching up. China's per capita GDP is much lower than the US. It will likely grow, but not surpass that of the US. But China has far, far more people. So in 2023, China has a per capita GDP of $12,614 US. The US has a per capita GDP of $81,695 US. It's a huge difference. They aren't even close. But the US has 334.9 million people, about a third of a billion as of 2023. China has 1.4 billion people. Simply put, if China had 1/3 of the US's per capita GDP, it would surpass the US in total GDP, and the US loses its supremacy as the economic powerhouse in the world. You kind of have to accept the basic idea that this is good and desirable. That's kind of the idea of the book. How can we avoid this? Well, you can try to raise per capita GDP, which is very difficult, or you can just add way more people, more specifically 1 billion Americans. Is this even possible? So we get into fertility rates, why the birth rate is low, how to fix that. We don't get any easy answers. We didn't get one in any of the last book. That's not really as much what this book is about either. In Matt Yglesias' approach, smart immigration is also very useful in raising that population. In order to maintain a high per capita GDP, you need to bring in immigrants who are able to contribute positively to the economic prosperity of the United States. So he gets into smaller scale examples of how plummeting populations are bad. I think this illustrates the potential national and later global impacts of population declines. Basically, when a city sees the population shrink, it's generally disastrous. When a city sees the population grow, it's good. It's good for the economy. It's good for the city. And likewise, we see these trends in countries. Contrast, for example, North American countries like the US and Canada, whose population grew in the past few centuries, to Europe, whose population was already high and didn't go up as much. A lot more opportunities for individuals to live the so-called American dream, to go from rags to riches, existed in North America over that time.
Well, there's a variance issue too, right?
Yep.
Like a lot of people think Europe's delightful. And
Europeans do.
Well, yes. I mean, they have great bread. Yes, but there's a high variance for a lot of this stuff.
Yep. So as a Canadian, how does this really help me? Would it make sense to have 1 billion Canadians? Canada isn't the leader in world GDP, far from it, but surely more Canadians would mean more economic prosperity for the country, but we're not going to be top dog anytime soon. He also argues that the U.S. isn't crowded, even if some cities seem to be. And this is true of most places on Earth. So Manhattan is crowded, for example, but even New York State, for anyone who's driven through it, is mostly empty space. A quick first approach would be to repopulate cities which are in decline. Beyond this, there are other ways to densify cities with better zoning, public transportation, and cultures that encourage more people. Just generally, growing small towns and small cities that can handle it seems to be a good approach to getting more people.
Is this all just like the logic is clear if you just accept that it's possible?
Yep.
But it seems like there's a large number of policies and ideas which just would not be implemented or are really hard to make it so they follow their intended purpose. Meaning, you can say people have to live in a certain place for a certain amount of time, but often people don't like that, and they'll just move.
Yep.
And if you somehow make it so they can't move, well, then they may not want to do the thing in the first place.
Yeah, so you need to have incentives, but the author is generally a big proponent of loosening laws and regulation which restrict, for example, building new housing and things like that. Well, things that are restricting growth of cities. I think generally the argument itself seems valid. It seems like if done intelligently, the U.S. could indeed support a much higher population, as could the world. This suggests that it's not bad to have more children and more than the amount that people are having now. But I think 1 billion is just not achievable.
Was it 1 billion by 2100? Was that the idea?
Or just his year? He gave a time ring. I think it was something like maybe 2050 or something like that.
But 2050.
I don't know. Whatever his time frame was, it just doesn't seem realistic that it would ever reach that.
Yeah, like 10 million a year.
Yeah.
I mean, they might be deporting 10 million a year for a couple of years.
Well, that's it. So the argument itself would be an argument against deporting people, obviously, right? It is a pro-immigration argument. And I think there are some people that argue that there are advantages to having less people, which is a pro-deportation argument. And I think economically, the numbers likely don't support that idea.
That's my loose understanding. Of course, it depends on the type of immigration and the type of work and everything else.
Sure.
Yeah.
All this said, I think AI is a big wild card in all this. AI threatens to fundamentally change the relationship between humans and work, as a ton of labor may be done by software and machines in the future. This may decouple population from GDP. It could be an existential risk to humanity in a way that climate change is thought to be and likely won't be, but just on a whole different scale. And AI may usher in advances in biotechnology leading to immortality, which ultimately changes the amount of children a person can have in a lifetime. It's hard to predict how that will go. I don't know that I could guess whether having more or less children is a good idea in light of the looming threat or promise of AI. And this is kind of the same with almost every decision you could possibly make with regards to an unknown future. People are good. I think people are good. Life is good and worth living. This is what I believe. And so I believe it is fundamentally good to bring children into this world. This is a values decision everyone needs to make for themselves, but this decision should be informed by information. How we go about that is tricky. Despite the content of these two books, I don't know of many concrete government policy decisions which would increase the fertility rate. Supporting parents financially may have small benefits and generally simply create a culture and attitude where having children is seen as good. Ultimately, the changes likely need to be cultural, and it looks like more people may not be the end of the world it may have seemed in centuries past.
Interesting. Sort of stylistically, I mean, aside from the content, did you enjoy how either book was written compared to the other? Were they written well, or just like, oh, there's some interesting ideas?
Yeah, they were both decently written. Not like, not poetically or anything like that. Just I liked the ideas. I liked the way the information were presented. Both of them are somewhat like evidence-based thinkers, I think. So their way of arguing kind of appealed to me. But yeah, at the end of the day, it's like, okay, we kind of danced around this, but I'm not taking away any great ideas. So yeah, I'd recommend both of them. The first maybe more for parents or someone thinking about having kids, and the second more just as an intellectual exercise in the kind of economics of it.
Yeah, that's fair. When you're talking about AI as a general issue, I was thinking like, well, if we get sophisticated agents that are sophisticated enough, maybe you get a couple trillion Americans in the next 10 years. And then that's its own weird thing of whether AI systems will have voting rights or other types of rights.
And those are potentially people, for lack of a better term, that do not consume resources, so don't have the negative effects of population growth that other things might have. They will have some negative impacts for sure.
Well,
but
I was going to say a little electrical resources or something like it, so it's not no resources. Mm-hmm. And then they have their own children.
Oh, yeah. See how that goes.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, thank you, Adam. So, if there ends up being a lot more people, Adam, it's probably going to make the roads busier. Which links to whether the 401 is the busiest highway in the world. Listener David Smith wrote in saying, I heard recently that the 401 is the busiest highway in North America, or the world. Is this true? And I wrote back saying, actually, I've had this on my to-do list for some time, as I'd also heard this. Yeah. Let's dive in. Since it's a Darren segment, we can't address the question without first asking other questions and clarifying definitions. Why do you always answer a question with a question? What do you mean? What do you mean by highway? What do you mean by busy? Well, highway, from Wikipedia, is any public or private road or other public way on land. It includes not just major roads, but also other public roads and rights of way. In the U.S., it's also used as an equivalent term to controlled access highway.
That seems much broader than I would generally think of what highway is.
So controlled access highway. What's this? Well, also known as a freeway, expressway, or motorway, is a type of highway designed for high-speed vehicular traffic, with all traffic flow and ingress-egress regulated. That's the stuff.
I think a road with no lights, it just goes.
So again, Wikipedia has a nice summary. This is a fully controlled access highway provides an unhindered flow of traffic with no traffic signals, intersections, or property access. They are free of any at-grade crossings with other roads, railways, or pedestrian paths, which are instead carried by overpasses and underpasses. Entrances and exits to the highway are provided by interchanges, by ramps, which allow for speed changes between the highway and the arterials and collector roads. On the controlled access highway, opposing directions of travel are generally separated by a median strip or central reservation containing a traffic barrier or grass. Elimination of conflicts with other directions of traffic dramatically improves safety while increasing traffic capacity and speed.
Oh, that's a much better definition.
Yeah, there you go.
I like that one.
It's now clear that in pretty much any conversation about highways or the highway I've ever had in Canada, we're talking about controlled access highways.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And some examples, the U.S. interstate highway system, the Autobahn in Germany, and in Canada, our national highway system that includes, but is not limited to, the Trans-Canada Highway.
When you mean national, these are federally regulated roadways versus provincial or municipal?
I mean, we do have controlled access highways that are provincial, but I was just giving you some examples.
Okay. The 401 is federal, isn't it?
That is correct. Okay, well, that's a long way of saying fast road, highway. What's busy? Well, what do you think, listener? How would you define the busyness of a road?
Speed the cars can go in traffic would be my definition.
That's actually an interesting one. I didn't even have that myself.
Yeah.
Number of cars, sure, that seems to be a relevant thing here, of course. Yeah. But at one time, per day, per year, regularly? What about traffic? How often would you use the term busy to describe many cars but no traffic? Right? Oh, it's very busy today. Were there lots of cars? Yeah, but there's no traffic. Like, well, you might say busy, but maybe you wouldn't.
Yeah, like you can have a road that's got bumper to bumper almost traffic that's moving smoothly, which is probably not likely.
Then it's not
I
bumper to
wouldn't
bumper.
think about that as being
unless
traffic.
they're all self-driving.
Yeah, you're right. They wouldn't be bumper to bumper.
All right, so let's look at traffic volume, or for you nerds out there, the annual average daily traffic, AADT count, which is the number of vehicles that travel a highway each day, averaged over 365 days.
A specific segment of highway or the whole length?
Well, you can pick both, right?
Yeah,
different lengths.
Very different metrics.
Different lengths will have different results. Mm-hmm. Along the 401, just north of Toronto and going across the city, that's what I'm going to use as a general term, the AADT count was 450,000. Wow, says a study from 2019. While another older study said it could be over 500,000 vehicles on some days. That's a lot.
Yeah.
500,000. How does that compare to other North American countries? Well, Mexico's highways are much less, with Mexico's busiest highway, which is a part of Mexican Federal Highway 54 in Monterrey, usually averaging less than 100,000 vehicles.
Oh, wow.
In the US, Chicago and LA seem to have the most traffic volume, but still not as high as the 401. Chicago's numbers seem to be under 300,000, and the 405 in LA is also under 280,000, according to data from the California's Department of Transportation from 2017.
Could this be because those highways aren't as long? Like the 401 goes most of the way to Ottawa.
Yes, but the number I'm giving you is not the stretch that goes all the way to Ottawa.
Okay,
right?
it's really for the part
specifically the part that's north of Toronto is what I'm giving
yes,
you.
okay.
Yes, the 401 goes quite far. In a way, it's across a huge chunk of
Cornwall, I think, on
a huge
one
chunk of
side.
Canada. Yeah, exactly. Now the problem with the information I just gave you is a lot of the data is several years old. Now it's not one of these things where every country and every state or province keeps up to the minute traffic record data that you can easily access. So usually there's some internal report that's released, which is not necessarily always up to date. So that's the busyness. Now there's also the issue of traffic. And of course, there's going to be different results depending on how you assess congestion. Mm-hmm. Some of the ones mentioned have a lot of traffic, like the roads I just mentioned, right? There's a lot of traffic on the 401 and in parts of California and in Chicago, but also in roads in Nigeria or India or China. And when I remember hearing, like, there's something about some traffic jam in China that was months long, and like that turned out being correct. But in 2010, there was a traffic jam in China that lasted for 12 days. Wow. And nothing like that has ever happened in North America, as far as I know. No. And so I was like, how busy was it? Like, 12 days? What do you mean? Like, what do you mean? What do you mean? 12 days, 62 kilometers or something. And I was thinking, like, there's no way, there's been so much traffic in Canada. It's a multi-day affair where I don't know, you leave and you come back. Like, how do you get food? I don't understand.
No, you're taking shifts. Someone's swapping it.
Maybe
I don't know.
someone comes along on a motorbike to sell you food. I don't understand it. So all I have to say is, so again, like if you're looking at traffic, then it has to be, well, congestion, again, traffic volume, and you'd have to compare it to, say, what the speed limit is or what a car could traverse in a certain amount of time. Yeah. Could it make the Kessler run in 12 parsecs? Or is there going to be more congestion out in space when there's nowhere else to go?
Interesting.
Now, if you use the internets and you get AI summaries and whatnot, you'll see that it does say the 401 is either A, over 400,000 cars, or sometimes over 500,000, which then is going to be the highest. But some results say that LA is sometimes over 500,000.
Oh, wow.
So I'm willing to loosely conclude that a 401 is one of the busiest highways in the world, and its main competitor seems to be, I think, the 405 in Los Angeles, with nothing else coming close. So it does mean that, yes, if you're in Canada, you get to drive along, if you're near Toronto anyway, one of the busiest highways in the entire world. And I hope that's validating, because when you're on it, you're like, gee, why are there so many cars here? At one point, there are 18 lanes.
Well, that's the thing, right? So yes, there's a lot of cars, but there's so many lanes. There's the collectors and the express and all this. So in Ottawa, you never get more than 3 lanes each way on the 417.
Not really.
But on the 401, there's just a volume of cars. And sometimes it's just like, it looks like it's never ending, but it's moving. You know,
it's usually moving well beyond collectors, as our little signs will tell us. And other times it's not moving at all, even though it's midnight and you're near the city. That's annoying. And one final little anecdote from a Reddit comment from 3 years ago from a deleted user. It's weird. Canadians are known for being polite, and in the city of Toronto, they drive relatively nicely. But get them on the highway, and it's goddamn Mad Max out there. It's like they're trying to anonymously kill each other after having to be so nice to each other in public.
The 401. I have to imagine that the 401 is the basis for the highway in the second Matrix film, and it's like never get on the highway. It's just like it's a death sentence to get on the highway, and then there's that cool fight scene.
It's one of the best highway fight scenes. Excellent stuff.
Yeah, I mean that's a joke. I don't think the Wachowskis would have necessarily known Toronto. I don't know if their whole background.
So all that to say, thanks, David, for writing in, and it was a good question. And it turns out, yeah, it is one of the busiest highways in the world. Adam gave us a segment on population and how it's hard to increase it once those numbers start going down.
Yeah.
Thanks for the book review, Adam. And thanks for joining us once again. Until next time, think better, act better.
Peace out, cuboids.
For show notes or to discuss this episode, visit our Facebook page and website at trcpodcast.com. For general inquiries or to send a topic or parody suggestion, email info@trcpodcast.com. Help support the show by leaving a review on iTunes and liking us on Facebook. Follow us on Twitter at TRC_podcast.
Wait a second. What are you doing again?
That was too long. Okay.
What are we at?
That's at 40, but we had some breaks there. But yeah, that was very long. That's very long. It's gonna be a terrible edit. Adam, why did you write so much?